the subjective feeling of gender is one thing, but it's when there is a demand that others shall kowtow to that, specifically when it becomes, therefore, because I believe I'm female, therefore I should be allowed to enter female athletic competitions, that kind of thing, where you're not just privately saying, I feel my gender is female, please address me as she and her. That's fine, but when you actually muscle in, kind of literally, on women's swimming competitions or boxing competitions, and gain the advantage of male physique, then I think that's another matter and not to be approved. I guess gender is a social construct, yes, but what is not a social construct is the male body that you bring to a female-only swimming competition, and that's real. Yeah. That's biological fact, and you're winning your medal unfairly by bringing your male body.
Do you feel good that atheism, or maybe a better term is godlessness, is ascendant?
Yes, I do.
And you don't hesitate to say that. You're not like, oh my God, what, God's going to strike me dead. There's no residual. No. There's no residual guilt.
No, I'm not. Yeah. There was a man called Charles Bradlaugh, who was the famous atheist in the 19th century, who would stand up and invite God to strike him dead. There was. I'm very fond of P.G. Wodehouse, and P.G. Wodehouse had a character called Galahad Threepwood, who told a story of somebody who said. He stood up and said, if I tell a lie, may I be struck by lightning this minute, and by very odd coincidence, he was.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to see me. I appreciate that greatly. I am Nick Gillespie. I'm an editor-at-large at Reason Magazine, established in 1968. We're the planet's leading magazine, which means the only magazine of free minds and free markets. This is a real honor for me, and I only wish that I believed in an afterlife so that my parents, who raised me as a good Catholic, I've got 5 of 7 sacraments, could be looking down from heaven and saying, what are you doing talking to somebody like Richard Dawkins? We didn't send you to Catholic school so that you could talk to an evolutionary biologist who effectively won the war against religion. And we're going to talk about that and a lot of other things tonight. And we're especially going to talk about his most recent book, which I suspect many of you already own. And it's like, it's like getting a Harry Potter book. When a Dawkins book comes out, you buy it immediately and then stay up all night reading it under the covers, right, with a flashlight. So without further ado, let's welcome Richard Dawkins. Please give him a huge round of applause. All right. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Richard, before we get into the discussion of the book, the Genetic Book of the Dead, a Darwinian Reverie, I want to ask, this is your farewell tour, your the final bow tour. We'll come back to this later, but let's put a little bit out there. What does an atheist look forward to after the final bow?
I'm working on another book.
Okay. All right. So,
And I don't expect to make a tour of it when it's finished, but I shall be visiting the United States again, just not on a major travel around the whole country.
all right. Very good. Let's talk about the Genetic Book of the Dead, or Darwinian Reverie. How many of you have read it?
It only came out yesterday, would it?
Well, I read it. I bought it and read it overnight. So how many of you are going to read it? Okay. How many of you are going to understand it? Okay. That is actually, I first encountered your work as an undergrad. I was a psychology major as well as an English major. And one of the things that struck me is I couldn't believe that I was reading science because I understood what you were saying. But in the Genetic Book of the Dead, you use a term, a palimpsest, as a controlling metaphor. Let's start by talking about that. What is a palimpsest, and why is it so important to what you're doing in this book?
A palimpsest is a manuscript which is erased, and then the paper, rather the parchment, is used again, because in the days when paper was not available and people wrote on parchment, it was quite scarce, they would reuse it. And so it would be partially erased or even wholly erased and then reused. The point of it in the book is that the Genetic Book of the Dead is a description that every animal bears in itself, in its genes and in its body, a description of the worlds in which its ancestors survived. This, it seems to me, follows from natural selection. The animal has been put together by a whole lot of selection pressures over many, many millions of years. That's why I call it a palimpsest, because it is partly very ancient writings in the Book of the Dead, and then partly more recent writings, and then more recent writings still, and finally writings during the animal's own lifetime. That's why I call it a palimpsest.
Would you give an example of, you in the book you talk about how sometimes that it is literally on the organism's skin or back or shell or whatever. What's a good example of how this functions?
Any camouflaged animal has that sits on the background that it resembles, and that's why you can't see it. I use the example of a desert lizard, a lizard in the Mojave Desert, which has more or less painted on its back a picture of desert. It's got little stones and sand. It looks like a desert. The whole of its back is a painting of the desert. Well, that's an obvious example, and any camouflaged animal is an obvious example. My thesis is that that principle must apply right the way through every bit of the animal, right into the interior of the animal. It's just that the camouflaged skin is the most obvious example. And I believe that the same principle must apply to every cell, every biochemical process, every detail, right the way through every part of the animal.
In the selfish gene, you did a number of things, that kind of changed the way that people understood evolution and the point of evolution. And one of which is the idea that, we think that we are using genes, or that somehow we're in control as humans, but in fact we're being used by the genes.
Yes.
We are kind of automatons or something like that. In this book, you say, you've outdone yourself by saying that we are actually a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses, or a cooperative of viruses. So now it's even more punishing. And I guess my question is, what do you have against human beings? But could you explain how you go from the selfish gene to this?
The selfish gene had what you call a sting in the tail. The last chapter switched to a different topic, which was memes. And I thought this book should have a sting in the tail as well. And so this is this idea that we are a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses. It takes a bit of time to explain. One of my books is called The Extended Phenotype. And this is the idea that the genes in an animal work to survive not just by influencing the body of the animal in which they sit, but they reach outside the animal, and part of the so-called phenotype of the genes is outside the body. And obvious examples are a bird's nest or a bowerbird's bower, which is not a part of the animal, but which nevertheless is a Darwinian adaptation. It's shaped by natural selection. And this must mean that there are genes for nest shape, genes for bower shape. Now, this principle of the extended phenotype applies not just to inanimate objects like nests and bowers, it applies to other individuals. An animal, a parasite, can influence the behavior of the host in which it sits in order to further its designs as a parasite. And that means that the genes in the parasite are having phenotypic effect on the body and behavior of the host. Now, if you think about a parasite in an animal, like a worm or a virus or a bacterium, its task is to get into the next host. Now, there are two ways in which it can do this. It can either be expelled from the host in some way, like sneezed out or coughed out of the host, and then breathed in by the next host. That's what we think of normally as a parasite. And when a parasite does that, when it exits the body by some such route as being coughed or sneezed out, it has no great interest in the survival of the host in which it sits. For all it cares, the host can die. But what about a parasite which passes to the next host via the gametes, via the eggs or sperms of the present host, mostly eggs, I suppose? Well, a parasite whose hope for the future is to go into the progeny, into the offspring of the present host. If you think about it, its extended phenotype will be identical. Its aims, its desires, its hopes for the future will be identical to the genes of the host. It will want the host to be a successful survivor. It will want the host to be a successful reproducer. It will want the host to be sexually attractive, to be a good parent, because everything about what the host regards as success, namely having offspring, will be the same as what the parasite regards as success, namely the host having offspring.
Kind of like my tapeworm myself.
Exactly. If the tapeworm were passed on via gametes, which it's not,
yeah,
but a virus can be. Well, if you think about the logical conclusion to this, all our own genes, the only reason they cooperate in building us, in building the body, in building any animal, is that they all have the same interests at heart. They all get into the next generation via the gametes of the host. In other words, they have the same interest at heart in exactly the same way as a virus that it gets passed on in the gametes, or a bacterium that gets passed on in the gametes. So that's why I say that all our own genes can be regarded as equivalent to a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses. You have to read the book to get the book.
Are you just becoming a softie? Because you've gone from, and there's extended discussions of the title, The Selfish Gene, and why it could have been many other, perhaps more accurate titles. But, you know, there seemed to be, and Selfish Gene was 76, right?
Yes.
It was published. Evolution seemed to be more about competition or its survival of the fittest, things
edgy.
like that. And now you're speaking more about cooperation.
No.
Can you talk about what may helped you move away from competition to cooperation?
I think that's a misunderstanding.
Okay.
I'm not becoming a softie. Or rather, in the sense, I always was a softie.
Yeah.
Because the selfish gene is not really about selfishness. It's about selfishness at the level of the gene, but that translates out into altruism at the level of the individual, or it can be, and that's largely what the book is, what The Selfish Gene is about. Genes are selfish in the sense that they are striving to get into the next generation. That's what they do. That they are, in a sense, immortal. But they do it by cooperating. I've always said that. In The Selfish Gene, there's a chapter in which I have the analogy of a rowing race, where you have 8 men, I think of the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, 8 men sitting in a row in a boat. And they're cooperating. And that's what the genes are doing. The genes are cooperating in building a body that will carry all of them to the next generation via reproduction. So they have to cooperate. The reason why they cooperate is precisely that they are destined to enter the future by the same route, the same exit route from the present body, namely the gametes of the present body. So I've always said that. I've always said that they cooperate.
Can you, at one point in the book, you talk about how there really are not genes for specific things, that becomes kind of, it's a misnomer. Can you talk about how that plays out, and where does that misunderstanding, we're always looking for the gene that does this, or controls this, or controls that?
Yes. When you talk about a gene for anything, it's tempting to think about it as a unit of, you know those butcher's diagrams where you have brisket and rump and flank and things like that. And it's tempting to think that there's a gene for this bit and a gene for this bit and a gene for this bit. It's not like that. Genes work together to control the processes of embryology. And so it's rather more like the genes are more like the words of a recipe, a cookery recipe, or a computer program, where they work together to produce a whole embryo, and then a whole baby and a whole body. So genes cooperate, as I've just said before, in the process of embryology. There's not a one gene for this and a one gene for that. The reason why you can, to some extent, talk about a gene for this and a gene for that is that you focus on differences between individuals. What geneticists actually study when they talk about a gene for the, well, Gregor Mendel, for example, studied wrinkled peas and smooth peas. Well, what he's really talking about there is individual differences. A genetic difference controls an individual difference. So when you talk about, say, there's the Habsburg chin, the hereditary malformation of the chin, which affected the royal families of Europe. The Habsburg chin. There are lots and lots of genes that enter into the making of a chin. But what this particular gene does is to make the difference between somebody who has the Habsburg chin and somebody who doesn't. So gene for X always means gene for difference between somebody who has X and somebody who doesn't have X.
At what point do you think, and try and pinpoint it to the year, did the Habsburg chin stop giving more inclusive fitness to the person having a Habsburg
I'm not sure
chin?
the Habsburg chin ever gave more inclusive fitness. The inclusive fitness is one way of expressing what natural selection would make a gene want to do, so to speak. I hope you understand what I mean when I use a word like want. Inclusive fitness is W.D. Hamilton's mathematical expression of what an individual organism will be trying to maximize if what is really going on is that its genes are maximizing their own survival. So the Habsburg chin almost certainly didn't maximize survival in any sense. Other genes do, and that's what natural selection is all about. But the Habsburg chin was just an anomaly.
Yeah. Can you have your work over time, certainly, in the genetic book of the dead, it collapses any kind of easy distinction or dichotomy between nature and nurture. And I realize I'm showing my age here by even using such outmoded terms. But can you explain how certain types, you talk about genetic templates or predispositions towards behaviors, then interact with the environment in a way that, that is different from the way that we used to be taught about either something was completely a function of kind of genetic determinism or it was cultural determinism. And we're in a very different world now.
Nurture comes from Shakespeare, doesn't it? Yes. It's an interaction, and to revert to what I was saying about individual differences, the statistical quantity called heritability is a statistical measure of the contribution to variance, which is a statistical measure of variation that genes exert. So leaving genes out for the moment, when you do, say, when Ronald Fisher, who's one of the fathers of statistics, worked for a long time on agriculture, and so he would be concerned with a field where you plot, where you have randomized plots, and you vary the fertilizer in different plots, and you vary the seed quality and that kind of thing. And so you have variation in the wheat growth which you can measure. That's the dependent variable. That's the growth of wheat. And you then look to see how much of the variance in wheat growth can be explained by variance in fertilizer, how much can be explained by variance in watering regime, how much can be explained by variance in seed type, for example, and interactions between them. So that's analysis of variance. A particular case of analysis of variance is where you partition the variance between genetic contribution to variance and environmental, and all the rest, environmental contribution to variance. And one rather powerful way of doing this is twin studies, where you take monozygotic twins, identical twins, who have all the same genes, and you compare the similarity between monozygotic twins with dizygotic twins, where you know that how much genetics they have, how many genes they have in common. So you compare, the dependent variable might be musical ability or height or intelligence, IQ, or you can measure anything you like. And you then say, how similar are monozygotic twins in this variable, say IQ, as compared with dizygotic twins? And you also look at monozygotic twins reared apart and reared together, and dizygotic twins reared apart and reared together. And by looking at all four of those categories, you can calculate for a particular population the heritability, the contribution to variance of the genes. And you'll come up with a figure like 0.8 or 0.6 or 0.3 or something of that sort. And so that's one way of measuring the contribution to variance of genetics, which is the way of sorting out nature and nurture.
In another part in the book, you talk about how the possibility of a nice example of how a cultural change, and you're talking about the taming of fire, can have evolutionary consequences, the shrinking of jaws and teeth.
Yes.
Can you discuss that? Because I found fascinating.
Yes. There's a book by Richard Wrangham, who's an anthropologist at Harvard, about the importance of cooking on human evolution. One of the things you see as you look at the fossil record, human fossil record, is that our jaws have shrunk. Our ancestors had much bigger, more powerful jaws than we have. And Wrangham thinks that this is because of the invention of cooking, discovery of fire, the invention of cooking, which enabled us to cope with tougher to make food less tough. We didn't need such powerful jaws. And so that's an interaction between culture, namely the taming of fire and the development of cooking, and genetic evolution.
How long, over what time period does that kind of emerge?
Well, it looks as though Homo erectus, which is our immediate ancestor species, which lived about 1 million years ago, had fire. It's not absolutely definite, but there do appear to be archaeological remains of hearths suggesting that they had fire. And they probably had cooking. At least Ragam thinks so. So maybe 1 million years.
Yeah. Are you able to keep those kinds of timescales in your head when you're thinking? I have trouble keeping my Google Calendar for a week.
I know,
but
yes,
how do you manage that?
Only by analogy. I mean, actually, 1 million years is nothing. I mean, we're dealing with hundreds of millions of years, thousands of millions of years when we talk about evolution, and it's frightening, actually. I mean, it's very hard for us to cope with. When we think about ancient Babylon, for example, we think we're sort of back in the mists of time. We sort of get a sort of frisson of ancient history, and of course that's just yesterday. That's 5 minutes ago, by geological standards. There are various analogies. I mean, you've probably seen analogies of if you represent the whole of geological time since the origin of life by a year, and then humans come on the scene. What is it about? 5 minutes to midnight or something. There are various analogies which sort of help to get it across. I mean, I like the one where you stretch your arm out and you say the origin of life is where my tie is, and then it's all bacteria up to about there, and then the dinosaurs are about there, and humans come on the scene about where my fingernail is, and the whole of recorded history, the Romans and the Hebrews and the Babylonians and the Assyrians, is the dust that falls from one stroke of the nail file.
Do you, as you get older, do you feel that time and history, does it speed up or slow down?
Speeds up.
Yeah, and does it speed up on an individual level? Does it speed up on a societal level?
On an individual level, I mean, time passes more quickly.
Do you remember I was going to say, do you remember your first memory? Which is a kind of strange sentence, but what is your first memory? And has it stayed constant over years?
Yes, I think my first memory was having an injection from a doctor. My second memory was having an injection from a scorpion.
Oh, wow. So, let's talk about science and the scientific method. You, last year in The Spectator, you wrote an article called Sticking Up for Science, and you said, yes, I, Richard Dawkins, at this late date in life, I'm going to stick up for science finally. But you were talking about the adoption of certain kind of Maori, you were in New Zealand and you were talking about Maori origin myths kind of being pushed into schools as science.
Yes.
Explain what was going on there.
This is a very strange business. I arrived in New Zealand and was immediately aware that I was in the midst of a great controversy. The New Zealand government, which was then a socialist government, it's changed now, but the present government, I think, is doing the same thing, is importing compulsorily into science classes in New Zealand schools Maori myths. And they are being given equal status to what they call Western science, which is just science. So it's not Western, it's just science. And so the children in New Zealand are, I would have thought, being bewildered by, on the one hand, learning about the Big Bang and the origin of life and DNA and things like that. On the other hand, they're being told it's all due to the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, who probably having it off together. And it's pandering to, I think, a kind of guilt that white New Zealanders feel towards them, I'm sort of psychoanalyzing them now, towards the Maori indigenous population, and sort of bending over backwards to show respect to the indigenous population. And I think that's fine. I mean, it would be great for New Zealand children to learn about Maori culture and Maori myths in classes on anthropology and history, but to bring them into science classes that's just not science. And I became involved because a number of distinguished scientists in New Zealand, fellows of the New Zealand Royal Society, which is the New Zealand equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences here, had written a letter protesting about this to a New Zealand journal called The Listener, and they had suffered as a consequence. They had their lectures cancelled. They were threatened with expulsion and things, really quite unpleasant victimization of these distinguished scientists. I had lunch with about half a dozen of them and heard all about it from them. And so when I left, I wrote this article in The Spectator about it.
And you mentioned on the flight out, the flight attendants on the New Zealand air flight thanked the Maori gods.
That's right.
Letting them
The
fly.
Maori gods were giving a lift to the plane.
And at that point, I guess you were making sure you had a parachute on, right?
Actually, Air New Zealand, and this is not really relevant, but they did have a rather attractive safety briefing in earlier time. You saw, you know it when it says, you know, when in the unlikely event of what do you call it?
The cabin losing
oxygen
pressure
comes down, and safety is our top priority, and lights will guide you to the exits, which are here, and here, all that sort of stuff. And you finally realize that all the people involved, the pilots, the stewardesses, the flight attendants, they were all naked, but they were painted with uniforms. So, and you only realized this right at the very end when you saw a female flight attendant walking down the aisle, and you saw from behind that she was actually naked, although she was painted with the... I thought that was a much better...
I've forgotten what you were talking about, to be quite honest. You also have a chapter in a collection that'll come out next year that the producers of this tour shared with me that's titled "Scientific Truth Stands Above Human Feelings and Politics." And in that essay, which is of a piece with what you're talking about in New Zealand, but also more broadly across the, maybe across the world, but certainly across the OECD economies, we can say, you talk about Lysenkoism and about the history of placing mere politics above scientific truth. Talk about Lysenko and the tradition of that, and why is that front of mind for you now?
Okay. In the 1930s and 40s, in the Soviet Union, in Russia, an agronomist called Lysenko, who was a charlatan, got the ear of Stalin. And he became immensely powerful because Stalin believed in him, partly, I think, or mainly because Lysenko's theories, he despised genetics, he despised Mendel and everything that we think of as genetics. And he espoused a kind of Lamarckian theory, which is acquired characteristics are inherited, which is false. And importantly false.
Can I ask just before you continue?
Yeah.
Do you know what was the origin of Lysenko's contempt for genetics, or was it that it was something that was unchangeable, or
I
that
think it was
pre-existed?
Marxism. I think that it was Marxist dogma. That, well, to go back to the question about nature and nurture,
Right.
that nurture is all important, and humans are indefinitely improvable.
Right.
And if humans are indefinitely improvable, regardless of genetics, then everything else ought to be as well.
Right.
Plants ought to be as well. And so I think that's the reason why it appealed to Stalin. In fact, I know it is because it was Stalin actually said so. And my chapter contains quotations from a book which was edited by Lysenko with the innocuous sounding title, The Situation in Biological Science Today, a very boring title. But it's a very sinister book because it's an account of a 1948 conference held in Moscow of Soviet agronomists. And it was a kind of hate fest against genetics and all Western genetics, all genetics apart from Lysenkoist genetics. And one by one, they got up and made speeches denouncing geneticists, and some of them confessing, rather pathetically confessing to their their sins, really, of having been Mendelian geneticists and how they now saw the error of their ways. And several of them were actually imprisoned, most famously Vavilov, who was a genuinely distinguished Russian geneticist. He was imprisoned and on a false charge of espionage and horribly treated and died in prison. But he wasn't the only one. So this was, I quoted this episode as an example of what can happen when politics is given sway over true science.
Can you, before I want to follow up on this, but when you say true science, what is true science as opposed to?
I suppose evidence-based science.
Yeah.
Because the Mendelian genetics, which Lysenko despised, is massively supported by evidence. And Lysenko's genetics caused a disastrous famine in Russia, which is directly attributable to Lysenko taking control of the whole of Soviet agriculture and Chinese agriculture as well, because it was adopted there as well. Huge, disastrous famines resulted from Lysenko's crackpot theories.
Where do you see the analogous energy in the contemporary world of a kind of neo-Lysenko?
Yes, the second half of the essay, which I hadn't realized actually you got a copy. I'm interested.
Yes,
in it.
I did.
Okay. The second half of the essay, having dealt with the first half, deals with Lysenko. The second half is about it's less serious, but contemporary in America and Britain, the sort of dogma that states that sex is a continuum, that sex is not binary, that you can be any sex you like, you can choose your sex. The sex that a doctor assigns to you when you're born is just a temporary assignation until you decide better what sex you are. And I made the comparison between this and Lysenkoism as an example of ideology being given priority over evidence-based science.
And this is because in a biological sense, there are only two sexes based on the gametes.
That's right. I mean, in the whole of the animal kingdom and plant kingdoms as well, for that matter, it's just about the only true binary we've got. Actually, I mean, everything else is a continuum: tall and short, fat or thin, black or white. I mean, this is all continuum. A spectrum of variation. Sex is the one thing which really is binary, and it's binary throughout the animal and plant kingdoms based on gamete size. The phenomenon of anisogamy. Male gametes are small and numerous, female gametes are large and few, and this comes from, it's quite interesting. I mean, there is a phenomenon called isogamy, whereby the gametes are the same size. So you have two equal-sized gametes. This occurs in some fungi and some algae, where you have equal-sized gametes, and you need two of them to make enough resources to make a proper zygote, to make an embryo. And mathematical models show that was unstable. What happened was that there was a runaway evolution towards some of these isogametes becoming smaller and exploiting the fact that others got larger. And so some got smaller, some got larger, and they got smaller and smaller, larger and larger, until now we have the situation throughout the animal kingdom and the plant kingdoms where we have these two different, radically different sizes of gamete. There are no intermediates, absolutely no intermediates. That is the basis of the binary sex difference.
Is that the conversation that's being had, though, when people, I mean, if we're talking about trans...
Yeah, they talk about gender.
And in that sense, you also, you discuss postmodernism, or you say this is a kind of epiphenomenon of postmodern thinking, yes, which gets rid of objectivity in favor of subjective issues of truth, which can also be politically manipulated, or yep, consensus that comes from that. What is the problem with somebody's, regardless of biological sex, if they say, I feel as if I'm trapped in the other sex's body and I want to live my life?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, I respect that, and if somebody wants me to use pronouns, right, then I do that. But the subjective feeling of gender is one thing, but it's when there is a demand that others shall kowtow to that. Specifically, when it becomes therefore, because I believe I'm female, therefore I should be allowed to enter female athletic competitions. That kind of thing, where you're not just privately saying, I feel my gender is female, please address me as she and her. That's fine. But when you actually muscle in, kind of literally, on women's swimming competitions or boxing competitions, and gain the advantage of male physique, then I think that's another matter and not to be approved.
You mention, the very tiny numbers. I mean, it's a fraction of 1% of the population that is almost, appears to be trans, and in the way that you're discussing it.
Well, not that small. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, quite a number of people say they're trans.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the statistic that you quoted that.
Oh, intersex.
Yeah, intersex.
Yes, but that's quite different because trans people don't claim to be intersex.
Right. Yeah.
So that's quite not.
And it's interesting. They're not non-binary either. They just think they're the other side of the binary.
That's right. No, what you're talking about now is intersexes.
Yeah.
Where you have, as you know, although the definition of sex is based on gamete size, what determines sex in mammals is the XXXY system, and that occasionally breaks down, and you have XXY people, for example, or X0 with no, and they are. Actually, those particular ones are unambiguously male, respectively, and female, respectively. But there is a tiny minority where it is something, I think something like 0.08%, which you could say are intersex by the...
I guess my larger question is, why do you think at this point in time, why is this discussion happening when it seems to... we are at a moment in, European and North American society for sure, where more people are more accepted than ever, and this seems to be a relatively small number of people, even talking about trans people. Why do you think there is so much discussion about this.
Well, I'm not a sociologist. I suppose I could call myself a memeticist. And
Well, you are the meme, the
yeah,
father
I mean,
of memes. So.
I think it's a fashion, like a fashion for wearing baseball hats backwards. It's something that spreads among young people, especially. I mean, I've had letters from American schoolgirl, one American schoolgirl, rather sadly, saying she feels she's the only sort of non-trans person. I mean, it's sort of. We all at school remember crazes where you have a particular toy that everybody wants, and so that spreads through the school like an epidemic. I think it's a bit like that.
You talk about how male and female, again, biologically are not social constructs, but is the expression of gender a social construct? And how do we, is it worth kind of figuring out, okay, where does that end and where does true biology take over?
A social construct, I think the sort of archetypal social construct, I try to get my head around what it means, even, and I think money is a very good example.
Right.
I mean, something like a bit of green paper with $1 written on it is worth 100 times less than a bit of green paper with $100 written on it.
And both of them are worth less than they used to be.
Yes.
I guess that's reality intruding.
Yes.
Right.
So money is clearly a social construct. Right. The number of days in a year is not a social construct because that's determined by the rotation of the Earth and the.
But the way that we talk about it changes. I mean, you talk about how the calendar.
Oh yes,
I mean the Gregorian and Julian calendars.
Yes, indeed, that's right.
And there were actual riots, right?
There's a rumor that when the Julian calendar gave way to the Gregorian calendar, there were riots because 11 days were lost. We'd lost 11 days of our life, and that was. Yeah. Well.
I assume people who were in dungeons were kind of happy, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's.
So I guess gender is a social construct, yes, but what is not a social construct is the male body that you bring to a female-only swimming competition, and that's real. Yeah. That's biological fact, and you're winning your medal unfairly by bringing your male body, and because you say my gender is female, therefore I'm entitled to. I mean, the male body is not a social construct; it's a biological construct.
Mine is kind of a failing construct at this point. So, if I just to push on this a little bit more, you attack postmodernism, and my background's in literature, so I need to speak up for postmodernism a little bit, in the sense of you said it's bereft of a precise definition, even in the minds of those who profess it. And I will grant that.
Can you give one? I mean,
yes. Yeah, I can.
I'd love you to.
A good working definition is from Jean Lyotard's book from 1979, The Postmodern Condition, when he says it is incredulity toward meta-narratives. So that it's, and in the most charitable reading, because I think in the most dogmatic and doctrinaire reading of a postmodern sensibility, it's an extreme version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that reality does not exist, only language exists, and reality is completely a function of the words we use to describe things. And if we don't have those words, we don't see it, it doesn't exist. And that is kind of crazy. But incredulity toward meta-narratives, and the reason I bring it up is because it seems to me to fit nicely into the way that you talk about science, or the way science actually operates, which is, it's not that we don't have meta-narratives, that we don't have large explanatory theories, but that we are always questioning whether or not they are the right one, and we look at the limits of knowledge rather than the extent of knowledge.
Would an extreme postmodernist say that before there were humans, there was no reality, there was no dinosaurs? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an extreme postmodernist, but that is
yes.
potentially a problem. Or, the thing that could be said is that, they would say if you grew up in a language that did not have a term, a word for the color blue or that shade, then you don't perceive it. And that seems wrong. That has been disproven by
Yes.
theories and things like that. But I guess before we turn to talking about atheism, another large project in your life, I wanted to ask that question of, evolution, not evolution, and not Darwin and not evolutionary science, but many appeals to the natural world have been used in a political context to legitimate certain kinds of social status quos. Women were too emotional, so they couldn't do this, or they were not strong enough. So I grew up in a world without women pole vaulters because, it was just deemed up until sometime in the 80s or 90s, women couldn't pole vault, of course. And then that changed. But is it, I guess, how do we know that we're doing science right so that we are doing it in a way that we are learning more as opposed to ratifying a social consensus with an appeal to nature or to the true?
Yes, I mean, I didn't know about the pole vaulters. That's interesting.
Yeah, go back and look. Where were the women pole
Deplorable.
vaulters in the 1956 Olympic
So
Games?
it was just assumed that they couldn't pole vault, and
They didn't have the upper body strength. Women
Yes.
don't have upper body
yes,
strength.
and they in fact do. I mean,
Well, they pole vault. I mean, they don't pole
Yeah.
vault as high as men, but
Well-
and many of them are quite attractive, I would say.
I'm delighted they pole
Yeah.
vault. I think
But you could substitute in any number of things. That women can't be chess masters. Women don't want to do this, or men don't want to do this because of their nature.
I mean, it is a curious fact that since chess doesn't actually require muscular strength,
Right,
there are very few women.
right. But it's also if they were not allowed in the clubs for long
Yes,
time.
quite.
I mean, there'll
Yes,
be a
yes.
time when
Exactly. Well, I think I agree with you. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, broadly speaking, how important is, and I'm not going to be able to use the right term, so excuse the imprecision here. How important is it that you were born at a time when you were able to take advantage of a liberal political era so that you could actually do a lot of the work that you did? If you had been born 200 years earlier, or God knows, 20 years later, maybe
Yes.
not, right?
Yes. Totally. I mean, very, very important, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What accounts for that kind of social, and I would say moral progress? We're more, we are more open as a society.
I am fascinated by this. I mean, in one of my books, The God Delusion, I talk about the shifting moral zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And there's something, you could say it's in the air, but that's not very helpful. But something changes as the centuries go by. And you've only got to go back to, say, the mid-19th century, where people like Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Henry Huxley, who were in the vanguard of enlightened liberal thought, right, by today's standard, were the most terrible racists. I mean, they would say things like, Huxley said, well, of course, nobody would take seriously the idea that our prognathous cousins had, he was, and Lincoln said something similar, that of course, I don't seriously think that black people should vote. I mean,
right. I mean, I don't want them to be slaves, but I don't want them around.
Yeah.
Either.
So the shifting moral zeitgeist is something that changes not just over the centuries, over decades.
Right.
If you look at fiction from the first half of the 20th century, if you look at Agatha Christie type thrillers. Detective.
One of her best-known novels can't be published under its original title.
That's right. Yes,
in the United States. At
that's
least,
right.
yeah.
And Bulldog Drummond, who was a sort of precursor of James Bond in the 1920s, I think, and 30s, would talk about things like foreigners and other unwashed folk.
Yeah.
Well, the zeitgeist moves on,
Right.
and why it moves on is a fascinating, I guess, sociological.
So what I'm hearing is if you could do it all over again, you'd be a sociologist.
I'm not sure about that, but I am genuinely curious about what it is in the air that changes. It seems to me to be it's a bit like Moore's law in computing, which is a definite mathematical straight line on a log scale in computer power, and I think it's not due to any one thing. It's a composite of things. And I think the shifting moral zeitgeist is the same. It's a composite of conversations and dinner parties, journalism, parliamentary Congress decisions,
technological innovation, scientific breakthroughs,
books. Just everything moves on. And
what do you think the role of atheism was in that, or has been in that? Because, a challenge to the supremacy of religion, if not as a kind of scientific theory of order, but then a social or cultural theory of order.
Well, I think atheism is just sensible. I'm not sure. I mean,
are there any atheists out there tonight? I mean, this is one of the most amazing swings.
But you're talking about a change in society.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it is true if you look at polls that Gallup polls that in America and in Western Europe, the number of people who profess religion is going down, steadily going down. There are more religious people in America than there are in the rest of Western Europe.
Right.
But it is coming down. So I guess that's part of the shifting zeitgeist.
What do you think? And part of that zeitgeist has to do with books that you wrote, or the colony of bacteria that you wrote. In order, who knows what they're getting out of it? But what do you think the most convincing arguments that you advanced were to people?
Could be the wrong way round to put it. I mean, if you want to believe something, you've got to have reason to do so. So, convincing arguments. It's rather better to say what are the most convincing arguments for theism. And I'm not sure there are any. But obviously there are a lot that appear convincing to many people. And I think the argument from design is probably the most powerful one.
Right. Because in a way, you kind of advance a godless design, though, don't you, with evolution?
Yes,
when you're
yes.
saying everything is designed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an astonishingly powerful illusion of design. And it breaks down in certain places where it is bad design, like the retina, the vertebrate retina being backwards, that kind of thing. But one of the things that I've tried to do in most of my books, actually, is to show how beautifully perfect the animals are. They really, really do look designed. And I think this is probably why it took so long for Darwin to come on the scene, that people just couldn't fathom the idea that it could come about through unconscious laws of physics.
Do you feel good that atheism, or maybe a better term is godlessness, is ascendant.
Yes, I do.
And you don't hesitate to say that. You're not like, oh my God, what, God's going to strike me dead. There's no residual.
No.
There's no residual guilt.
No, I'm not. I'm not.
Yeah.
There was a man called Charles Bradlaugh, who was the famous atheist in the 19th century, who would stand up and invite God to strike him dead. There was. I'm very fond of P.G. Wodehouse, and P.G. Wodehouse had a character called Galahad Threepwood, who told a story of somebody who said, he stood up and said, if I tell a lie, may I be struck by lightning this minute. And by very odd coincidence, he was.
You, despite not believing in God, you have called yourself a cultural Christian for at least over a decade from my readings. What do you mean by that?
Nothing more than the fact that I was educated in Christian schools. And so...
in a Christian society. And Christmas in England is
in a
pretty
Christian
great.
society. That's right. And it doesn't mean anything at all. It doesn't mean I'm sympathetic towards... it doesn't mean I believe it.
You, by the way, in 5 minutes, we're going to start the question and answer period with the audience. You can start to line up over in this aisle. If you have a question, it will be a question, and it will be brief and concise and illuminating. But so you can start lining up over in that column. You have said that if you had to live in a Christian country or an Islamic country, you would pick the Christian country every time.
Yes, I would not wish to live in a country where the penalty for apostasy is death, and where
that would be
gay people are thrown off high buildings, and women are stoned to death for the crime of being raped.
But other than that, Dr. Dawkins, there is an argument that a kind of liberal political philosophy, which allows for limited government, it allows for things like free speech and open inquiry, things like that, proceed from Christianity. The English Civil War. Part of the argument there was that the king did not have dominion over other men because we are all equal in front of God, etc. I read a critique of you saying that you are a person who has been in the tree of Christianity and you've been sawing the branch off your whole time, and now you're calling yourself a cultural Christian. You're kind of free riding on something. How do you respond to that?
I'm rather sorry I said that thing about being a cultural Christian, because people have taken it to mean that I am sort of sympathetic towards the belief, which I don't at all. It's just that I always have been. Now, that thing about the sort of society which lets science be free to do what it does, being a Christian society, that's a matter for historians, and they might be right. I mean, it is possible that that Christendom was the right breeding ground for
what we have now,
for science to arise in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And your point about the English Civil War could well be valid as well.
What religion, organized religion, again, at least in Europe and North America, and I think throughout the world, the research I've seen kind of suggests this, with obvious exceptions, but religiosity is declining. What happens if, I'm not going to say we're evolved to be religious, but religion has been a part of human history and civilization. Is there an issue that what replaces it, or rather, that the religious impulse grafts onto other forms of disbelief or non-thinking belief, extremism?
Yeah. I mean, G.K. Chesterton is possibly wrongly thought to have said, when men stop believing in religion, they believe in anything. there could be something in that. It's rather a pessimistic view. I mean, I would like to think you believe in evidence. I think it's rather demeaning to human nature to suggest that they've got to grasp onto some, giving up one sort of nonsense, you've immediately got to go and seize on some other sort of nonsense.
So before we go to the audience questions, which will be questions and will be wonderful, can I ask to go back to the idea of your final bow? What happens to you when you cease to exist, when you become brain dead, or however we define death?
Well, you cease to exist. I mean, you.
No, but you. Where do you have a mental image of what
Well,
will happen to
it
you?
will be just like it was in the time of the dinosaurs when I was nothing. I think, was it Mark Twain said I was dead for billions of years before I was born and never suffered the smallest inconvenience.
Yeah. Do you, what do you hope that you, and I apologize for the morbidity of some of this, but what do you hope you will be remembered for? What will be, you are a palimpsest, my pronunciation is way off, but you are writing over previous scientists, previous thinkers, and things like that. What do you hope is the message that sticks around long enough to influence people after you?
I suppose the message of the selfish gene that natural selection chooses among immortal replicators, which happen to be genes on this planet, but which are anywhere in the universe where there is life, it will be the same principle, the Darwinian principle of the non-random survival of randomly varying, potentially immortal replicators.
Okay, let's go to questions.
Can we have the lights up, please?
Yeah. Okay. We've got 30 minutes for questions. I am going to end it when the clock runs out, so let's go through questions as quickly as possible. Go.
Well, I do have a question, but I just very briefly wanted to say that
You're breaking the rules.
Okay.
You're breaking the rules.
I'll skip it then. I just wanted to say thank you. You were an inspiration to me.
That's
You're
very nice.
incorrigible.
I'll take that. I'll take that.
Okay.
I've been doing some research, and I don't think the audience here would be inclined to take interest in it, but
Thank you so much.
I wanted to just pose in the abstract, though, the question that's at stake in terms of principles, which is with respect to change of state of matter. I've been encountering some confusion because I understand that there's a difference between temperature, which is a qualitative absolute or an intensive property, versus heat, which is an extensive property, has to do with the quantity of calories, thermal calories being released. So with respect to a change of state, is that, I'm asking this to you in your capacity as the former professor for the public understanding of science at Oxford. I was hoping you could help me understand this issue. Is the change of state, is it absolutely regulated by temperature? Or does the thermal quantity of calories, could that cause a change of state irrespective of the temperature not being?
I wish I was a physicist. I'm not a physicist. I'm sure there are physicists here who can answer that, but I'm not one. I'm sorry to say. I don't think I can help you on that. I'm sorry.
Thank you for the question. Big hand. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Maybe a little bit more within your field of study. Parents today of an embryo can select for or unselect certain genomic traits prior to implantation, and I think inevitably novel gene editing techniques will affect clinical embryology. I'm wondering to hear your thoughts on how you foresee gene editing in the field of clinical human embryology, and more importantly, I guess if you were to steer that ship in some way, where would you want it to be in 2 or 3 decades from now?
Yes, it's very interesting. As I understand it, this can be done using IVF, in vitro fertilization, where you have you get a woman to superovulate, and so you have, say, in a petri dish, you might have 10 embryos, and they might have divided up to the 8-cell stage. And what you can do then is you can remove one cell from the 8 cells, and without damaging the embryo, and look at its genes. So in principle, you could, instead of re-implanting in the woman one of these embryos at random, which is what's done at present, you could choose non-randomly which one you implant. Well, in those cases where there is some reason to fear a genetic defect, such as hemophilia, the obvious thing would be to non-randomly choose one of the 50%, whatever it is, of the embryos that does not a carrier of hemophilia. I think it's hard to imagine anybody objecting to that form of what would amount to eugenics. Where it becomes more controversial is where in the future, and not perhaps a very distant future, it's possible to say this embryo is going to be a better musician than that one, or a more intelligent, a better mathematician, a better rugby player. I mean, these are not totally fanciful in the not too distant future. And that becomes controversial. I'm not entirely sure why, because it doesn't, it's not eugenics in the sort of Hitler sense of forcibly sterilizing people. It's just simply choosing, instead of choosing an embryo at random to re-implant, you choose non-randomly. One objection to it is that it could be a sort of privilege of the rich to do this kind of thing. And so that would be regarded as unfair. I suppose, well, I can't see much objection to it if you're asking a moral question.
It does mean the end of the Habsburg chin. There's no way it survived,
yes,
right?
yes.
So that's good. Thank
that's
you
right.
very much. Let's, next question, please.
Yes, hello. So thank you for doing the tour, Mr. Dawkins. Much like you, I was raised Christian, and then when I got to college, that's when I started losing kind of my faith and my religion. So now I describe myself as an atheist. But then, and that hasn't been much of a conversation with my wife up until we had children. So we have 3 children under 4. And so I'm wondering if you find any merit to the idea of raising them as cultural Christians until they're old enough to make their own mind, or they go through the process that I went through the same, and whether they end up on one side or the other, it doesn't matter. Because again, the fear is, as you quoted, once you don't believe in God, it's not that you believe in nothing, it's that you start believing in anything. So that's kind of be the
Is
fear.
this something you're facing
Thank you.
yourself at the moment? Do I gather it's a dilemma you're facing
Yes,
yourself?
he has 3 children under the age of 4.
For my children, so it's
Yeah.
more.
Yes, yes.
Myself, I'm pretty good with my convictions, but I'm
yes.
saying how should I carry that to my kids?
Well, okay, that's interesting. I mean, I do feel that there's something wrong with the automatic assumption that people make that a child will inherit the religion of their parents, and I sort of make fun of this by saying, would you ever speak about an existentialist child, or a logical positivist child, or a postmodernist child? And of course you wouldn't. But religion is the one thing where there is a kind of presupposition that a child will tend to inherit the religion of its parents. I was once at a conference, at an atheist conference, and there were lots of children there. People brought their children, and their children, they sort of had a playing area. And at one point, somebody stood up on the platform and said, "All you atheist children, come up on the platform." And I hit the roof, because this is not what it's about. I mean, that's exactly what I criticized in the assumption that a child of, say, Catholic parents is a Catholic child.
Oh, you can assume they're anti-Catholic deep down.
Yeah.
Is there an age of consent for religion?
Well, it's hard to make a definite,
Yeah.
it's another continuum. It's, as I said, biology is full of continua. I think if you live in a Christian society, and if your wife is Christian, then I think it's reasonable to educate children so that they know about Christianity. I mean, in my book, The God Delusion, I lament the illiteracy of some people of the Bible. I think it's very important to know something about the Bible. You can't appreciate English literature if you can't take your allusions. If you don't know the Bible as literature. So I think it's not totally wrong, I think, to not tell the child you are a Christian child, but this is Christianity, and this is the Bible, and educate them in what the religion is, and the literature of the religion, the history of the religion.
Thank you. Next question.
Good evening, Professor. I had a softy question, if you're okay with that. I had read your lament for Douglas Adams, and it was very moving. And if you haven't read it, it's really an element of poetry for me. And I was hoping you could share a story about Douglas Adams, if you were comfortable with.
I first met Douglas Adams because I read Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Not The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. I wrote him a fan letter, the only fan letter I've ever written to anyone. And he wrote me a fan letter back, which was very nice, and invited me to go and meet him in London. And so I went to his house and knocked on the door. I was not prepared for his gigantic size. I mean, he must have been nearer 7 feet than 6 feet tall, and was well proportioned. Well, he wasn't fat. I mean, he was. Well, I just mean well proportioned. And he was laughing as he opened the door, and I think he was laughing because he knew that I would be amused at his height. And it was a wonderful. I mean, he showed me all around his house, which was littered with dead Macintosh computers. Because every time a new Mac came out, he would be the first to get it. And so the previous ones were just sort of put on a shelf and gathering dust. He was my go-to guru for all things technological. I would, whenever I had a computer problem, I would email him, and wherever he was in the world, which could be absolutely anywhere, he would immediately reply and solve my problem in using language which I could understand, which might not necessarily be the case if I ring a so-called tech expert.
Thank you very much.
Next question, please.
Hi, Professor Dawkins. I think quite recently you've described Christianity as, I think, like a fundamentally decent religion. I think you've done that mostly in comparison to Islam, and I mostly agree with that sentiment, but do you think that sort of provides cover for Christianity? I think you've accused moderates of providing cover for Christianity before.
What's the key word? Would you say cover?
So if you're calling Christianity a fundamentally decent religion, Christians might feel like, well, Christianity's fine to kind of latch onto as opposed to other religions. Do you think that provides extremists and people that are sort of like fundamentalists cover?
I'm not getting that word, cover.
Cover, does it provide an excuse or a way of glomming onto something?
Yes. I mean, I said that in an interview on the radio, and I only meant that Christianity, like I said, doesn't advocate throwing gay people off high buildings, and it's not much.
Anymore, right?
Not anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not much of a recommendation. I mean,
Right.
I think
I think fundamentally is a strange word to use there, is all, right?
it is, relatively speaking, a decent religion, relatively
enough.
speaking.
Fair enough.
Yes. And I have said that I've never met an Anglican clergyman that I didn't like.
Okay.
Thank
That's
you.
a tepid endorsement for one of the worst religions in the world, right? One of the worst sects. Next question, please.
Hi, huge fan. So I go to a four-year college, and I'm curious about what you think of the current state of American universities, and do you think they will recover from some of the things that have been taking them over?
Current state of American universities.
Yes, referring to
I wouldn't
ideology.
dare.
Have you paid off your student loan debt yet? Or-
I wouldn't dare say anything about the current state of American universities. Well, who would? I mean, it's I get it in the neck if I say anything about American politics. No, I mean, I suppose to be serious. I mean, some American universities are the finest in the world, and some are not. But that's true of any country, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, please. And the quicker we go, the more we get to.
Thank you for coming to Milwaukee. My question is, with how connected we are with the whole world and with the advancing of technology, if you could challenge all the scientists of this current generation to answer one problem, what would it be?
One problem. Well, I think you probably mean a problem that would benefit mankind,
Yes.
rather than an academic problem. I mean, I'm very interested in academic science, and I would like to see the solution to the origin of life, for example, which isn't going to benefit mankind at all. It's purely academic. I don't know what I would choose to benefit mankind. I think I'm.
What about immortality?
Well, I don't know about immortality because there wouldn't be room for everybody.
Okay.
And
Well, there's a whole lot of planets out there that we can.
well, now, yes, we're talking about exporting humanity to the universe. This is something which some science fiction people have thought about. It's a pretty inhospitable place out there. You would have to. I mean,
You should see Milwaukee in December.
I mean, exporting to Mars is the ambition of one very rich individual, and he has good reason. I mean, it's a sensible ambition in a way, because it's the let's put all our eggs in one basket argument. The meteorite or comet that killed the dinosaurs, there will be more like that. And whereas the dinosaurs didn't have the technology, we potentially do have the technology to divert such a missile. It's an interesting problem. It's not a matter of it's not sort of shooting straight at us. It's in orbit around the sun, an elliptical orbit around the sun, and the orbit may happen to coincide with it. We can foresee that in a few hundred years, its orbit will coincide with ours. All you have to do is speed it up a little or slow it down a little, change its orbit, and it's only a matter of a few miles per hour change in velocity that you'd need in order to do it. So it is doable. Human technology in the not too distant future could do it. So that's a reasonable ambition. Whether it's reasonable to colonize Mars, I mean, that's a really difficult one. And beyond that, other star systems, that's way in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
do you pay any credence to or see any validity in the stoned ape theory? I.e., it was psilocybin and psychoactive compounds of its ilk that gave rise to sentience in chimpanzees 6 million years ago. And if so, I'd love for you to elaborate on it for about a minute.
I didn't get that, I'm sorry to say.
The stoned ape hypothesis that our human predecessors ate magic mushrooms and that jump-started the development of our brain.
I'm not familiar with that theory.
Would you like to be?
Yes, I would. I would like to read up on it. As always, when I hear an interesting theory, I like to read up on it. What's the name of the book?
I've seen it in a handful of different articles
Terence
and journals
McKenna
and whatnot.
I've
never seen it. I've never seen it in a book before.
We'll get you
radar.
an Amazon link, but Terence, the work of Terence McKenna, speculate. Thank you very much. Next question.
Yes, thank you. So you're talking about the shifting moral zeitgeist earlier. I'm curious about the degree to which you accept the contributions of continental philosophers, for example, like Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida, and the way they describe power structures and elucidate the evils and ills of them. And we see a lot of artists using those theories in the way they create their work and put it out into society. And I'm curious about whether or not you view those as beneficial contributions, like moral contributions as secular humanists, or how much we should take those into account.
I again plead total ignorance. I mean, I learned from Nick just now more than I had known before about postmodernism. It didn't make a whole lot more sense than I had thought before.
Okay. Let's to simplify it. Did the European continent, not the Isle of the United Kingdom, the Isles of the United Kingdom, have they done anything worthwhile? We can simplify.
Who has?
No, I'm joking. But thank you. I think. Yeah. Next question.
Hello, how are you? My name is Hassan, and I'm really honored to be here with you and talk to you. My question with you, going from the start 14 billion years ago after the Big Bang, with all of the randomness and the ectopy that we have in our world, suddenly around 2 billion years ago, there is a selection that happened that actually drive all of us to this point where we're actually conscious and talking to each other, while actually that's. My question is, we call it the natural selection. Why, or how you could explain a selection that happened without a consciousness or awareness? And where does this selection actually happen? Because if it's a selection, and we know it's a selection, where it happens and who? Maybe religious people will call it God, maybe others, but I would just like to clarify what's your answer on that.
That sounds like an interesting question. I didn't quite hear it though.
I think he was talking about how, given the moment. Do you want to repeat it?
Yeah.
Stand closer to the microphone.
All right, sorry for that.
Thank you.
So I was asking about 14 billion years ago, where the Big Bang started, and all of this, the universe started going on. 2.2 billion years, where the first natural selection that was actually there, and this selection happened to lead us to this point where we're all conscious and aware about this. My question is, how the first selection, the natural selection, how this happened, and in which consciousness, who make this selection to be happen, and these genes to be selected, to be driven this way till we reach a point where we're actually both conscious human beings talking to each other and discussing conversation.
Did you
get that? I'm still kind of stuck in the stoned ape theory right now.
I would love to treat it because I have this question for a long time.
I'm so sorry.
It's a question, and just quickly, I think, how did natural selection begin? Where did that come from?
Who selected?
And arrive to a point where all of us are sharing a consciousness that we can actually communicate through? Does that get towards some of it?
I would just try to simplify it more. Who is selecting in the national
Who is
selection?
selecting?
Oh,
in the
who's
national
selecting?
selection?
By the way, you should read his book because he talks about that. But, sir.
Well, nobody's selecting. I mean, it's just life or death. There is no selector. This was Darwin's great insight. Darwin looked at artificial selection, breeding of cows and horses and pigs and cabbages and roses and things, where you have a selector who actually chooses which offspring to rear and which not to. And then you can turn a wolf into a Pekingese by doing this. Mm-hmm. What Darwin realized is you don't need a selector. There is no selector. It's just survival. It's just some individuals survive and some don't survive, and it's their genes that get passed on.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's part of the brilliance of genes, right? Is that evolution, it propagates. But, this is one of the things I was taught about your theories when I was an undergrad, that, people used to think that evolution was going to a particular point or a telos, an endpoint, which was always human. But in fact, it's just a chaos machine. It's just creating more and more of everything.
Yes.
And then some hit and some don't.
Yes.
Next, well, thank you, sir. That was an interesting question. Yeah. Next one, please.
Hi, good evening. It's an honor to have you in Milwaukee. It might surprise you to learn that a lot of people denounce British food. So what are some of your favorite British dishes?
Oh, thank you. Okay. And curry is out. Okay?
Well, actually,
no Indian food.
There really almost isn't a British dish. I mean, curry is it's pretty much become curry.
Is that a good thing
it's
or a
brilliant.
Great thing?
No, it's brilliant. Okay. I mean, the other thing is that Indian restaurants are always open. I mean, you can anytime you can get food, and it's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Big honor to be able to ask Richard Dawkins a question. Considering that this is your final farewell tour, I'm interested to know if there's any ideas or thoughts or concepts that you've reversed, changed, or softened up on a little bit since the beginning of your tours. And if so, what are the top ones that come to mind?
Thank you.
Well, Nick said I was getting soft.
Yeah.
And I denied that. I suppose I don't get so aggressive, perhaps, towards people who talk nonsense. A bit more tolerant. I certainly have made mistakes and have changed my mind about particular details. In the first edition of The Selfish Gene, I was very scornful, for example, at the so-called handicap theory of animal communication and especially sexual selection. And by the time the second edition of The Selfish Gene came out, I had to change my mind in a big way. And that's a particular example. It's fairly not that minor. I mean, it was a definite mistake which I corrected in the second edition, mainly because of brilliant mathematical modeling by a student of mine, Alan Graffan.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, my name's Shamel. I have a question about your scale of religiosity. You said you were a 6, not an extreme 7. I was wondering, do you have any spiritual leanings?
Thank you.
Well, spiritual, that's an interesting word because I think I'm spiritual in the same kind of way as Einstein was. And Einstein was always using spiritual language, but he did not actually believe in God, although he used the word God a lot. I think, unfortunately, because people wrongly assume that he believed in God, which he didn't. But I feel something you could call spiritual when I lie on my back in the tropics and look up at the Milky Way and just feel spiritual about the immensity of space. That's just a local galaxy.
So when you're saying spiritual, you don't mean that there is a world that is not governed by material
Absolutely not.
concerns, but
No,
that you feel part of something expansive?
I have an emotional reaction to the immensity of space and the immensity of time and the immensity of biological complexity. But I'm a materialist. I mean, and so I prefer not to use the word spiritual. I use the word spiritual in deference to the questioner, but I would say that I'm a materialist.
We have time for one last question. Make it a quick one and a great one. All right.
I made it a 2-hour drive, worth it. So a common way you use to ridicule religion is to use one religion to argue against another. I think it's very powerful. So then that makes me wonder if the world only has one religion, and that is consistent in its Bible, and it's always tell people to do good, and it even doesn't have many supernatural things except there's a God and there's no evidence. That will make it very hard to argue against. What do you think?
All right, thank you. If there was only one religion in the world, and regardless of whatever else it said, it basically taught people to do good for other people and themselves, it would be hard to argue against that, wouldn't it?
It certainly would, yes. And I think I believe in that. I mean, it doesn't have a very easy rationale that one can derive from evolutionary biology, far from it. But I think I could say that I would want to live in a society where people are good to each other and not selfish, sort of really almost the opposite of a Darwinian society. And I've said this before, that I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to explaining why we exist, and a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to the way of society that I would like to live in would be organized.
I think you're getting a little soft.
Yeah.
All right, so if you have a VIP ticket, please stay in your seat. But the evening has concluded the interview. Please join me in standing up and thanking Richard Dawkins for coming. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.